says, are we going to start by, I'm going to invite John. Sorry, I didn't do this for myself. I'm about to ask you to describe yourself, John, and then I realised that I haven't done that for myself. So I'm a middle-aged white woman wearing round glasses, and I've got a brown and white spotty necklace and a blue jumper on today. So, John, would you like to introduce and describe yourself, and then we'll kick off?
Yeah, thank you very much, Linda. I'm John White. I'm Chief Operating Officer of the space. I'm a white middle-aged man. I'm wearing round glasses. I've got a beard. I've got receding hair. Might be caused by too much time thinking about evaluation frameworks. And yeah, that is me. And yeah, just to do a little bit of a scene set on this work, and also to echo what Linda said just now, we've got, I can see from the attendee list, a lot of different expertise and different cultural organisations and funders and so on represented in the room. And do please contribute to the chat and your own perspectives on this, because it's a big and complicated topic. And much as I'd love to say there's a right way and we've come up with some great solutions, there aren't perfect ways to tackle this, and lots of variety. So it'd be lovely to have that conversation going. The catalyst for us for this work was coming off the back of COVID, when there was a lot of digital activity going on. We were aware that understandably focus was shifting back to in-person venues and experiences, and we wanted to make sure there was a really robust evidence base around the range of value that digital work can continue to give. And so back in 2023, we worked with the University of Exeter's Business School through a knowledge transfer partnership with them to do some research into what was already out there around digital cultural content evaluation. So they did a mixture of a literature review and ran a survey and did interviews with key stakeholders from cultural organisations, evaluation consultants, funders, etc., to see what the state of play was. And this broadly confirmed what anecdotally we already knew, which is evaluation is often challenging, both because of time and budget and because of expertise. It can be quite complicated. It's often done in quite an ad hoc way, rather than fully integrated into projects, and people sometimes can feel quite out of their depth around the technology, the infrastructure. There's a general lack of shared terminology, so people understanding what they're talking about, exactly what specifically they're meaning, no real common frames of reference, and it's in a world that is rapidly evolving, where there are different platforms emerging. Those platform owners may change what metrics are available for us to understand audience engagement, so that adds a dimension of complexity. And where there are larger scale evaluations of digital activities and wider cultural activities, in fact, there can often be a bias either towards sort of gross audience reach, large statistics, big numbers, or if you look at things like evaluating city culture activities and those bigger kind of projects, are skewed towards sort of trying to measure economic impact. So having done that piece of work, we then stepped back and said, typical of kind of how the space tries to operate, what can we do to help cultural organisations with maybe quite limited resources, or even individual creative practitioners, to think in a structured way about evaluation and in a way that's not overwhelming. So our plan with this strand of work is been to create a simple, practical framework that helps you think through how to approach evaluation. By design, it's quite high level, because some of the reasons I've touched on, this is a changing landscape, technology's evolving, metrics are evolving, but also just the sheer range of digital cultural activities, from something in person like a VR thing or a tablet in a museum, through to online YouTube, podcast, etc. There's a whole range of types of experience that we might be wanting to think about impact around. And so necessarily thinking quite broadly about how to think through systematically those things. And also importantly, we didn't want to replicate work that's already out there, and there is a wealth of resource around cultural evaluation. So we pulled together a steering group to help us think through that, and get a range of perspectives, people from different cultural organisations, different art forms, different sizes. Also, we have representation of the Centre for Cultural Value, which does a lot of excellent work in the broader space of thinking about cultural evaluation. So a couple of things which links will appear in the chat that I strongly recommend if you want to familiarise yourself more with evaluation. They have an online course in partnership with the University of Leeds, which is really well structured and gives you that sort of overview. And they also have an evaluation learning space that they run in partnership with Culture Hive that I'd strongly recommend you checking out. Also on our steering group, Counting What Counts, who run the Impact and Insight Toolkit, which again is a really useful, very practical way of gathering feedback not just for digital activities, but they do offer sort of tools around that as well. And then again, on our steering group, we had representation from the funders, Arts Council England, who are funding this strand of work anyway, and also Creative Scotland. So that gave us quite a broad group of people to draw on their expertise and think through. The final thing I want to say in the scene set is just to give you the big picture of how the framework and how we came to think conceptually about an approach to valuation. And I just have blissfully a single slide on this, which hopefully you can all see. So if we think of the universe of what we're trying to measure as that big circle on the outside, there are three main groups that you might want to consider in thinking about the impact of your digital work. The one that most people default to is audiences and thinking about measuring audience impact, which is great and important. And I guess the key message we're trying to land there is don't just think about that in terms of big headline reach numbers, but think about what meaningful audience engagement looks like for you. The next circle is creators, and we define that very broadly. So that's not just the artists and the creatives that are involved in producing work, but anyone else in that sort of production process. That might be digital specialists, it might be people working on marketing, those thinking about where to distribute the content if it's online content. So that's quite a big community. And if you've got work that is being co-created where the audience is part of the creative experience, then there's that overlap in terms of those participants who might both be you might be having an impact on them in terms of them receiving a cultural experience, but also impacts in terms of their skills, capabilities that might be similar to what you're trying to identify in how you're impacting on the creators. What that leaves us with finally is that everybody else, people who were not involved either as an audience or a visitor experiencing something, or were not involved in the process of producing it. And those wider world impacts we know anecdotally are really interesting in terms of the partnerships, or even something like this session where we're sharing insights with a wider sector about particular projects. So those impacts clearly have value and potentially longer term value than the project itself. The measurement of them does represent some practical challenges, but we don't want to forget about the potential of those impacts just because some of the measurement is a bit challenging. So in terms of a scene set, that's probably enough from me. Yeah, hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar and the dive into the case studies. Linda, back to you.
Thank you, thanks. And John will join us again for the panel session at the end when we're discussing some of these questions more broadly. So that's a kind of the thinking behind it. And what the rest before the break, we're looking at two case studies, as I explained earlier, and so echoing what John's point about the framework and the group. So the case studies are really considering the audience experience and the creator experience, and then the section about thinking through the wider world will cover that in the panel discussion later on. So so we really wanted to bring in our artists to sort of think, what is this like from the perspective of the people doing and wanting to understand their audiences and what's going on for them. And so we brought the two case studies are from the sort of ground view really of what they did and how they worked. So I'm going to start by inviting Kerryn Wise to join me. And hello, hiya, Kerryn. So in this next session, what's going to happen is I'm going to ask Kerryn to start by just introducing and describing herself. Then she's going to give us a bit of a background to Displace Studio. Then she's going to talk and set up the work, Replica, the piece. And then she's just going to go straight into her case study. And then, so if you have any questions for Kerryn, put them into chat. We'll pick them up at the end. So Kerryn, is that all right? I'll just hand over to you and away you go. Thank you. And we've got a slide just showing, we've got a picture of Replica so you get a sense of what it looks like as she describes it. Thanks, Kerryn.
Thank you, Linda. And hi, everyone. Really great to be here today. So yeah, as Linda said, I'm Kerryn Wise and I am one half of Displace Studio. And I also work as a research fellow on the Immersive Arts programme at the University of West of England, where I am doing some audience research. So I kind of come from two sides, artist and researcher here today. So Displace Studio is a collaboration, like I said, between myself, I'm a choreographer, dance maker, and Ben Neal, who is here today. Hi, Ben. And he is a creative technologist and digital artist. So together we use cutting-edge technologies and the immediacy of live performance to create intimate and personal audience experiences that focus on actually finding human connection through the blend of the live and digital. We are the kind of core team, and then we work with a range of artist collaborators on a project-by-project basis. So Replica, which is our piece that we made through a Space Digital commission, and has done a kind of premiere, and we're now moving into tour booking for the work, is a 10-minute mixed reality dance experience that uses immersive technology to display a virtual dancer who interacts with and occupies the same space as a live performer, who you can see in the picture, essentially allowing her to duet with her digital double. The piece is experienced by one audience member at a time who wears a VR headset, but it uses pass-through so they can see the real space, the real dancer, and the digital layer. And this work combines live dance. We use volumetric capture to capture the dancer, and the work really explores how we present ourselves and connect with each other in a world of growing digitization. It explores themes of presence, mortality, memory, aging, and loss. So in terms, I'm going to start by talking about the audience evaluation. So audiences are really central to our practice. We often map the audience journey, both physically and emotionally, very early in our creative process. And in Replica, as you can see from the picture, the audience member is actually on stage. They're up close to the performer and the piece happens sort of around them. They wear the VR headset, as I said, so that they can see the live and the digital blending and merging and separating. The audience member can stay seated or they can move around. And at the end, there's a moment where the live performer offers a moment of physical touch. And this has been really, really powerful for audiences in quite an unexpected and surprising way. For the space evaluation, we were focused on finding out from audiences if the work was kind of moving them emotionally. In what ways was the work connecting and resonating with them? So in terms of the steps we took, we did 2 user testing sessions sort of halfway through the making process, and we did those at 2 separate venues. So we did it at BOM, Birmingham Open Media in Birmingham, which is a kind of immersive space, so audiences who know tech and work with tech. And then we did it at Dance East in Ipswich, which is a dance house, so a dance theatre space. We wanted to choose a kind of tech immersive venue and a dance venue because we knew that they would get different types of audiences. At these user testing sessions, we gathered written questionnaire feedback and we ran a focus group at BOM. This mix of methods allowed us for more kind of communal discussion during the focus groups where audiences could kind of share individual experiences, because the work is one-to-one, but actually kind of, have a bit more open discussion and dig into some of the themes a little bit more. Whereas the questionnaire lets audiences give obviously more individual answers. We use this initial feedback to develop the work and identify really kind of tech issues, onboarding issues, so the practicalities of getting people in and out of the headset, as well as more general feedback on themes and content and how that was kind of connecting with audiences. And then we did a premiere at a venue called Lakeside Arts in Nottingham, which is a kind of dance theatre arts venue. And there we did further questionnaires, slightly different questionnaires, and a focus group. We were really lucky to have amazing support, not only from the space, but also from Dr. Sarah Martindale from the University of Nottingham, who helped us to craft the questions, the audience questions, and was also there to support the running of the focus groups. And, you know, as a very small team, it's really useful if you can have someone there to help you on the day when you're sharing your work, because you're often, you know, busy with other stuff. So we were really lucky to have Sarah there to support that. Overall, we gathered 37 questionnaires, and then we've got the focus group recordings, 2 focus group recordings. So in terms of what we learned, or the insights from the audience research that we did, it was really useful for us to just get a sense of how is it actually meeting audiences, especially in a piece like Replica, where the audience member is participating essentially because they are on stage, they are really up close to the live performer. Overwhelmingly, we had really positive responses regarding things like the blend of the live and digital, the sense of intimacy that was created, the sound design, the choreography, and especially, which I think is really interesting, often people think digital work is kind of lacking a kind of intimate connection or a human connection, but actually the way that the audience is actually connected with our live performer Kim, and her digital double. So the empathy that was described in relation to the digital was really, really interesting. And it was also a testament to how brilliant Kim was in the work as a live performer. People talked a lot about the emotional connection that they felt with Kim within this piece. It was useful in the evaluation to see reoccurring words in the audience descriptions. And these are kind of outlined in the case study, which is online, but things like intimacy were kind of reoccurring words that came up. So it helps us to understand how our themes and concepts are actually translating through the work, especially in something like dance, where it's nonverbal, it's often quite abstract. So actually understanding how your themes and ideas are communicating is really, really useful. It's also useful to hear about how the actual technology is working in terms of wearing the headset. And in Replica, on the whole, audiences seem to forget that they were wearing the headset as they got so involved in the work. There were also several comments from audiences around the headset sort of acting as a kind of mask, because they were very close to the performer, but they had this thing on their face that meant they felt like there was a little bit of distance, and that if they didn't have it on, they might have felt uncomfortable being that close to a live performer. So I thought that was really interesting. One audience member talked about, the VR headset acting as a conduit for getting very close to the performer. And another said that it was there and hid his tears as he kind of responded emotionally. We had some really emotionally charged responses to the work, which always kind of surprises me in how powerful this kind of blending of live and digital can be, because the piece is only 11 minutes long. So to have that powerful effect is always really surprising in short work. We also, with our audience questionnaire, asked much more practical questions to do with the length of the experience, where it could be staged, where audiences thought they might like to see the work, ticket prices, marketing materials, and all of that information is really useful for us because we're now planning a bigger tour of the work, and it helps to really inform the decisions we make around where we tour to, ticket prices, marketing materials, all of those kind of things. So now to open out and talk a little bit about evaluating the creator experience. And for this project, that included the freelance artists that we were bringing on board for the project, the venue programmers that we worked with, and the marketing teams, and then Broadway Near Now, who are exec producers on the work. So I'm going to start by talking about our collaborators. We're a really small team, and obviously we're only bringing people in as and when we've got funding on a project by project basis. So it was really useful to think about actually getting feedback from them on things like payment structures, contracting and payment structures, things like intellectual property, and whether they felt that they were being credited fairly within the work. Things like our working atmosphere when we're in the studio together. And I think we wouldn't necessarily, without kind of working through the framework, have asked those questions or found time to ask those questions. So actually having Rosanna working with us, and she actually did those interviews with our collaborators. So we're not having to ask those questions, means they can probably be a bit more open with their responses. So that was really useful. The biggest thing for me really is around the feedback we got from the programmers and the marketing teams. And it made me much more aware of the barriers that can be in place for presenting this kind of work from a venue perspective. And despite the venues saying very much they trusted the team and having really faith in the quality of the work, feedback did highlight things including cost, staffing, accessibility of the tech, getting an audience, the scale of the work, and how that fits into their wider programming. as being kind of risks to programming this kind of work. And as a sector, we do need to address this in terms of building confidence for venues to be able to program this kind of experimental immersive work. There are also the issues of we also had the issue of some of the marketing teams really not understanding what the experience was and therefore how they would market it to their audiences. So for us, that made us really consider how we can make a bigger range of marketing materials to support different types of venues going forward. We learned that having really good documentation, which the marketing teams can watch, kind of walkthroughs almost of what happens in the experience to inform these teams is really crucial, as well as offering a range of different marketing material. For example, some venues where their audiences are not necessarily used to presenting this kind of work probably do want an image with an audience member in a VR headset because it says immediately what's happening within the work. Whereas other venues like BOM might want something that is a bit more thematic around the kind of content of the work. So for us, it was really useful to understand that different venues are going to need different things. And so now as we move towards the tour, we've put together a kind of much bigger kind of asset pack that we can kind of give to venues. And so that hopefully helps them, get audiences for the work. So I don't know whether Rosanna is going to join right now.
She is. I'm going to ask Rosanna to join us, but she's appeared. Can I just go ask? There was one question, quite a specific question, Kerryn, before we go into sort of thinking a bit more about the creator side of things. But somebody asked, how did you incentivize focus group participation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think there are different ways of sort of approaching this. If I remember rightly, the user testing was kind of a free experience, and then the idea was that we just invited audiences to come. We made it really clear beforehand how long it might take, because I think obviously coming and seeing an experience and then doing a focus group can be quite time consuming. And I think things like, having water, having tea and coffee, we didn't do any. I know some people do kind of vouchers and things like that. We didn't go down that road of kind of giving people kind of remuneration for their time. We just asked people to come, and some people couldn't stay for the focus groups, and so I think that's why having a questionnaire, which was like a QR code or an iPad they could do at the venue, and the focus group meant people could opt in and out for what they could support us with. And we found that actually audiences on the whole were really excited to try something new at a very early stage and to give us that feedback and feel part of the development of that work.
So thinking about people more being open to supporting you in evaluation if they feel like they've had a really rich experience.
Yeah, and that actually we're taking care to really listen to the feedback that we get, and actually there's some value in understanding audience experiences and feeling like that then feeds back into the work that we're developing, but then in the wider sector and how we can kind of evolve that sector. So I suppose, especially for the user testing, that was a kind of open invitation, and so people were keen to kind of come and be part of that. When we did the Lakeside premiere, that was slightly different because audiences were buying tickets for the show, so then there is a slightly more difficult element there where we sort of, I guess, invited people to stay and do the focus group, but they didn't have to, and if they didn't have the time or they didn't want to, then of course that's okay.
Thank you. And again, I would really encourage the audience to, if you've got experience of this yourselves, what do you think, as a general question, what have other people found incentivizes people to participate? That's really helpful.
And not making things really long, I think, is the other thing I would say. That actually, if you're saying come and spend 4 hours, and I think what we had to be careful about, because Replica's one-to-one, we didn't want people to have to wait until sort of 4 or 5 people had done it. So if you were the first slot and then you had to wait for the focus group, which was 2 hours later, people aren't going to do that. So what we actually had is this kind of rolling focus group. So people could, as they came out of the experience, they could sit and chat, and then some people would stay for ages, other people would stay a little bit, and then the next people would join. So it just became this quite organic, people dipping in and out rather than a set timed focus group.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks, Kerryn. So Rosanna, when I'm going to ask you the question really, which is about thinking about, the fact you worked with Kerryn on evaluating the creator experiences. And can I just point something out that, so somebody's asked a question about in relation to your external evaluator, and I think it's because you mentioned Rosanna in your talk, Kerryn. How much time did you employ them for? So in this case, it's not a relationship of employing someone. This is a partnership between the space and Displace to do the evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, they might also mean Sarah Martindale, who is audience researcher that we worked with from the University of Nottingham. So Sarah runs the virtual and immersive production studio at the well, is a creative director of that at the University of Nottingham, and her work is around kind of audience research. So luckily we're associate artists there, and so Sarah is happy to give her time to supporting us, because then we share that data and we can write up kind of papers as well as kind of the evaluation case study that can share that data. So Sarah, supports us with that in kind, because it's part of her research role at the university.
And I think there's a bigger question we might get to at the end about, where are all the structures to support? Where can you get more information? Anyway, must bring Rosanna in at this point. Will you, Rosanna? So I'm going to ask you to think about, that work that you did with Kerryn and what else you observed and thought about. Will you introduce yourself and to describe yourself, and then talk a bit about the work?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Linda. So hello, everyone. My name's Rosanna. I am Head of Content Distribution and Audience Evaluation at The Space. I'm a white woman in my 30s. I've got long brown hair and I am wearing a sort of denim shirt today. So I worked quite closely with Kerryn on using, testing the Space's evaluation framework with Replica. And as Kerryn's just described, she already had a lot of kind of brilliant evaluation processes in place with audiences. So my role mainly was around kind of helping to sort of get insights from that data, but also focusing more kind of fully on like the creators and what Kerryn and Ben's intended outcomes were for that group of people that we cover in our evaluation framework. If it's all right, I'm going to very quickly share a slide just to show people what the sort of 3 intended outcomes were for creators. Just to sort of help anchor the conversation. So when we worked with Kerryn to think about creators, so as John said before, we think about creators in quite a broad sense when we're thinking about our evaluation framework. So all of the individuals and organisations who are in some way involved in the creation of a digital work. And when we were working together, Kerryn chose to focus the evaluation, as she says, on members of the creative team. So Kim, who's the dancer and co-choreographer of Replica, and Daniel, who is the sound designer. As well as the venues, so working with the marketers and the programmers at each venue to kind of understand their experience. So these were the 3 intended outcomes that we defined together. So the first one was for Displace Studio to gain an improved understanding of the experience of the performer and sound designer to support the sustainability of the work and future working practices. So like Kerryn said, I conducted interviews with Kim and Dan to ask about their experience on the work. Those questions were mainly open-ended to try and encourage sort of, in-depth feedback. So quite open questions like, please tell me about your general experience of making the work with the team. Is there anything that could have improved the experience for you? Like Kerryn said, we also asked some very specific questions around crediting and IP and payment structures. And as Kerryn also talked about, I guess something to think about if you are wanting to interview members of the creative team to gather those insights as part of your evaluation picture, is just thinking about how you create conditions where people feel comfortable giving that open feedback. So obviously thinking about accessibility and creating a space that's comfortable for people to be able to kind of participate in the way that they want. Thinking, as Kerryn says, about who interviews them, for a variety of different reasons, it can be quite difficult to kind of give open feedback to people that you have really close working relationships with. So just thinking about how you facilitate that. And I think also just being really clear about what you're using that information for, so that they're really comfortable with how you are using and sort of, sharing, if that's relevant, the information that they give to you. The second outcome was for Displace Studio to generate new venue bookings and increase financial investment in Replica. I won't say too much about this because obviously this is something that Kerryn and Ben are tracking and it's a longer term objective. But where I was more heavily involved was with this third outcome, which is to help increase confidence in programming and marketing immersive work among the venues and the wider sector. So to support this, we did two things. So the first was that Kerryn shared the audience insights that they gathered from Replica with the venue programmers, which I think is obviously a really helpful sort of feedback loop for the venues to be seeing what audience members are saying about the work and kind of building that understanding of the experience of immersive work in general. And secondly, we gathered feedback from both the programmers and the marketers at each venue to understand their experiences and needs. So we designed separate surveys for marketers and programmers to ask very specific questions around what their considerations are when they are programming immersive work, why something might be a risk to program. As Kerryn said, feedback on marketing materials, what people need in order to feel confident in marketing immersive work. And I think, I know that Kerryn's touched on a lot of the learnings there, but I think one of the things that was really interesting for me in kind of looking at the feedback that we got from the venues was when we asked people what would help you to feel more confident in marketing immersive work in future, really interestingly, nobody said additional budget, which it kind of suggested that it's the sort of knowledge and experience of how to engage audiences and who those audiences are, I think, as well, for immersive work that is most kind of critical at this time, which I think is interesting and something for us to kind of like consider as a wider sector as well.
So interesting, isn't it? I was going to ask you both really about, the idea of evaluating immersive work specifically, but what you're touching on is that when you're thinking about the creators and the kind of practicalities of it, you've learned a lot. Is there anything else that you think is specific? The question is to either of you. I don't know, Kerryn, maybe to you first. Is there anything else specific about evaluating immersive work?
I think often these experiences, I mean, slightly differently at FOM, but often, I'm a dance maker. So often I'm targeting kind of dance venues who might not have programmed a lot of immersive work. So that often means that the audiences that are coming to see the work, it's a really new type of experience for them in terms of, and we did actually with the audience survey, we did get feedback on things like how familiar are you with immersive experiences and how familiar are you with dance experiences? So we've also got that data so that we can kind of use that to frame our analysis of what they then say in the other questions. But they're often new types of experiences. You're also asking audiences to not be passive in these experiences. So I think it's kind of, for me, it's really important to understand then how that's impacting the audiences that are coming into the work. So actually, do they find it really intimidating, and how do I talk about it in the marketing that makes it clear to audiences what to expect when they then come? And it was interesting actually in FOM that despite the blurb kind of really clearly saying it was one audience member at a time, a few people did turn up not realizing it was going to be one-to-one and then going, oh, it's one-to-one, how do I feel about that? So I think the care and the onboarding at the actual venue, as well as what you put in the marketing, is really important just to kind of support new audiences into the experience and out of the experience. And actually one of the things that we're definitely going to do as we go forward with this work is have a sort of offboarding quiet space for audiences, because people would come out of this experience and so many people would be very emotional, would be in tears, would be just heightened sort of sense of, wow, what has just happened to me? And actually we found that you don't want to just sort of shove them back out into the real world. So actually having a kind of quiet space where people can go to and have a glass of water or just sit or whatever, I think is really important. And actually, as we're now approaching venues, we're kind of asking venues if they can provide that kind of space for audiences after.
Thank you. I've got one other question for you, and then I'm going to invite Richard to come and do his case study. But what I was just wanting to, Rosanna first and then Kerryn, and we just need short answers really because for the time. But Did your thinking about evaluation change through the process? Was there any change as you went along? Did you, from where you started to what you ended up doing, not in terms of outcomes, but the process of it? Rosanna, did you kind of start and then carry on, or did some things shift?
That's a really interesting question. I think we were kind of like designing it as we went with the sort of creator stuff. Like I think what I would say there is that, we are very much learning as we go as well with evaluation. And I guess because as Kerryn says, there were 3 performances at 3 different venues. Obviously, there was a learning loop that was happening each time Replica was in each venue, and so there was a thing around timing. When is a good time to sort of survey venues and marketers, and do we do it at the end? I think we did that in the end. We surveyed them after they'd been to all venues to gain sort of insights about the experience as a whole. But I think there's always a bit of kind of teasing out of specific questions, really thinking through the wording of like, is this question going to get the sort of information that we need, and drafting things and redrafting things. So it felt very collaborative, and I guess because we didn't have a super clear sense of, this was one of our first case studies, so we didn't have a super clear sense of how it would go until we did it, and we were learning as we went as well.
Lovely, thank you. And Kerryn, picking that the same question, but thinking about the audience side. So did that change as you evolve as you went along?
I think, as Rosanna said, you're sort of learning as you go along. I think for us, working with someone like Sarah Martindale and also Rosanna, in terms of how we're crafting those questionnaires, what I think was really interesting is it wasn't like there was a bank anywhere of questionnaires that I could go, oh, okay, as an artist, what do I want to ask? How do I want to ask this? And actually that sort of feeds into the work I'm doing on the Immersive Arts programme, which is actually trying to create a bank of questions for independent artists and small companies that actually, obviously, they need to be quite specific to specific projects, but actually there were no kind of, bank of questions out there that as an artist I could go and say, oh, okay, maybe I'll amend these, or this would be useful, or this wouldn't be useful. And so, within my role on Immersive Arts, I'm going to be hopefully creating some of those resources that might be useful for other artists. So I think that process of developing a range of different questionnaires with Rosanna and Sarah's support has been really useful.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you both for that. I'm going to invite Richard to join us now, and you two can have a bit of a rest, and we'll see you again later on. Thank you. Hello, Richard.
Hello.
Hiya. Would you start, much as Kerryn did, will you start by introducing yourself and giving us a physical description, and then I'll invite you to just go for it and tell us about the work that you did around here.
Yeah, I'm Richard Hurst, and I work at Levenshulme Old Library, and I'm a white man in his early 40s, wearing a red and black shirt and hat and glasses, many layers.
Okay, smashing, thank you. So you've got some slides which we're going to sort of use as a framework. So we're going to kick those off, and then over to you, really. So you're going to start by explaining about the project and then think much more about the evaluation. So
yes, thank you. I will talk about this project that we can all see called You Are Here, 5 stories about parks in Levenshulme, which is hopefully fairly self-descriptive, but I'll talk everybody through it. So are we okay to go through to the next slide? So I think it's useful, before I kind of get into the project, to say who we are as an organisation. So Levenshulme Old Library is more or less what it sounds like. It used to be the library building in Levenshulme, which is a district in South Manchester, a diverse, built-up urban area. And the same way that happened in many neighbourhoods across the country around 10 years ago, the library was closed down by the council due to austerity measures, and it was taken over by the community and has now a second life as a arts space. So we're an arts charity with a focus on the area, on engaging communities with creativity in their neighbourhoods where they live, which obviously gives us a lot of scope. We've got a beautiful building, we've got a big space we can use for lots of activities and projects and so on. But there is a bit of a flip side to that. We are often limited by what we can do by being bricks and mortar venue more than anything else. So when we're talking about engaging people and finding out what they want from the arts, what they would like us to do. We're often limited by being able to really only engage with people who are already through the doors, perhaps therefore already somewhat engaged with what we're doing and what's going on. So what we wanted to do was create a project that allowed us to go outside the building and go into the community and connect with people who we may not already have a connection with, and find out what they might be interested in, what their engagement with the arts were, and basically what they wanted, essentially, on a creative level. I guess next slide, please. So this takes us to You Are Here, which is the project. So when we looked around at the area, even though it is, like I say, a built-up urban environment, we are blessed by having a large amount of parks in the local neighbourhood. So those were interesting because they are democratic spaces in a sense. Nobody has to pay to access them. People use them all the time for going for walks, walking their dogs, taking their children for the afternoon out, that sort of thing. So you get a good cross-section of community using them. No fee to access them, so it felt like a good arena for doing something interesting and creative that was rooted in the neighbourhood. My background, as well as working for this organisation, is in the world of publishing. Essentially, I work as an editor and a fiction writer and a project manager for independent publishers. So doing a literary project felt like the obvious and, in some ways, for me personally, safest route to take. So we selected 5 parks and decided to commission 5 fiction writers to each create a short story set in and responding to the park. The idea was we'd give them some resources, some history of the park, we'd interview some people and give them the interviews to listen to. We'd create some field recordings that they could listen to while they're doing the writing. And as part of the project, we also commissioned, 2 of the writers we commissioned were emerging writers. So we had 3 that were more professional and had a bit of publishing and professional experience behind them, and 2 people who were essentially completely new to this sort of thing. And we kind of worked with them to develop their story, to make sure it was as good as it could be for the project, but also to see what we could do in terms of giving them development and support for their creative practice and their career and so on. And so that's what we did. We commissioned these stories, and then in our building, we have a resident community radio station. So we used the facilities that we had at our disposal to create some really high quality, studio quality podcasts were then released. And as you see in some of the pictures here, we created some posters that went up, sort of QR codes with design on them that we put throughout the parks across the neighbourhood that could then wander through these parks and encounter these things, scan the QR codes and listen. And the idea really was to give people something that combined these 2 worlds. Like, you can't really get much more analog, I don't think, than just an open grassy space. Yeah. So the idea was to create something that people could have this kind of digital overlay, if you like, to the experience they had. And the fiction would not just be a story that was about the park and set in the park, give them information about it, but would in some ways kind of take them for a walk. So the idea was that you go into the park, you'd scan a QR code, and it would take you around these spaces and give you a fictional story.
We've got links in the chat to the podcast, so people will be able to hear all of that lovely content that you have created. Do you want to kind of start to tell us a bit about how you're thinking about evaluating the podcast project? Yes.
We just go through to the next slide. So we wanted, with this project, to create something ambitious for the neighbourhood, something that people responded to. We also wanted people to think a bit differently about these quite everyday spaces. A lot of people encounter these spaces every day, and they can feel quite humdrum, quite functional. We wanted to do something that made them see these spaces differently. We also wanted to understand who we were engaging with, because obviously the thing about just taking something and putting it out into the neighbourhood, you can find anybody. Like, we weren't really expecting literally everybody who kind of went through the parks to engage with these projects, but we thought anybody could, and we'd really want to understand what value they were getting from it. We also wanted to understand the creative's point of view, what kind of an unusual project like this for the writers, all of whom are based in the area, and our producer, our engineer, what they thought of this project. That's kind of a bit of a unique thing for someone to encounter as a professional writer. So those are the things we were really keen to find out, was to get a sense of what they thought of the project, more or less, like project itself, and what it could mean for us to do next, to do in the future.
Thank you.
Yes. Can I have the next slide, please? So we worked with the space to create a framework that would allow us to ask the questions we wanted to ask, and worked out the best way to embed that, working out how we can ask people the questions that we want to ask them when we don't really have a captive audience in the sense that we might do if we're in the building. We can't kind of corner people and get them to fill in the forms. We have to kind of embed everything quite early into the project and make sure that all the footprint, if you like, of the project had something that could lead people to giving us the information we wanted to get from them, which included embedding surveys and all the links we had online, including the giving us some reporting and feedback into the messaging that we kind of had within the project. So we talked about on social media or via community networks or direct conversations with people. We'd really push them to give us the feedback that we were after for this project. We also encouraged it other ways, like I mentioned here, like we've got competitions, we've got a local cafe in one of the parks, so we worked with them to get some free coffees for a year, or another place that's like got a bike repair place, and they gave us some goodie bags we could give away. So really trying to incentivize people to come to the parks really and listen to the podcasts and engage with the project, with the idea that would then lead them to giving us some feedback. And the other thing that worked well for us was direct one-on-one conversations, essentially. So it being community-based as an organization and the project, you do encounter people day to day. You'll run into people and they'll go, oh, I've seen these signs up in the park. Are they anything to do with you? And you go, yes, they are. Did you enjoy it? Could you tell us in a way we can capture and really use, and tell us, what did you think worked? What did you think didn't work? Have you encountered things like this before? Do you usually read or listen to contemporary fiction? Like, what do you think about all these things? Just giving us all really useful things that we could then use to essentially design future projects that we wanted to think about.
So you're thinking thinking about it from the very beginning, and your evaluation is all about what can we use, how is this going to help us to sort of evolve in this area?
Yes, yeah. It's a lot of it was thinking about developing, because obviously, like I said, we can do lots of stuff in a building, but it's different to take it outside, and it's trying to figure out if it works, if there's things that we could do differently, and where people might think the gaps might be.
Lovely, thank you.
Can we have the next slide? So the things we found out by doing this project, that the people who engage with the project did find that they felt a stronger connection to these spaces. That was a successful outcome in terms of the project. We found that people, they came and they listened, and it did make them feel differently and feel kind of a bit of a sense of ownership of these spaces, creative ownership that we really wanted to make happen. The other thing was that we did find that a lot of people who were responding to us, they told us they didn't ordinarily engage with this sort of thing. There's something about presenting things in a kind of fun, perhaps an accessible way, that just pops up in people's day-to-day going around, that really captured them and made them kind of respond and engage and listen and think in a way that I think if we'd done an event at the building, or we'd created a publication perhaps that was a bit kind of more formal, people would not have engaged with the things we would have created. So we were quite pleased with that. And the other thing that people were, they were enjoyed it, which is obviously something you don't want to find out when you're getting feedback from people. And people really did engage with it. So as well as creating the fiction element, we also the resources that I spoke about that we created for the writers, we kind of decided, well, we could release those as well. So each of the parks had a fiction podcast, but we also had a sort of mini documentary, sort of portrait of the park that we released. and then a sort of mini soundscape, and we kind of released them all and put them out there. And we found that people really did respond differently. You know, there were some people who were like really there for the fiction, some people who really felt that kind of this heritage type pieces that we put out there about the history of the parks was really, really interesting, and just something that they were really engaged with when they encountered it. So those are all really positive things. There was a bit of some of the questions that we did have was around representation, because we're a very diverse area, and there was some questions about the makeup of some of the writers on the project that we worked with, which was something we anticipated, and I think is a fair question and part of a broader discussion. But it was something that we thought about, and we're kind of grateful to kind of get some
thank you.
Can we get the next slide? And the creatives that we were working with, they told us that they really valued working on something that was both in their neighborhood but also about their neighborhood, which is quite I think a rare thing to encounter as a creative, that someone wants to commission you essentially to creatively respond to your area and have that kind of live in the area as well. They appreciate the project with the structure around it and the support that they received, and they found it a meaningful experience, both creatively, professionally. I think in particular our producer, who was traditionally would be a quite functional radio engineer, appreciated being treated as a kind of creative, was involved in the process. And we were interested in, leaning on him creatively to do the things he wanted to do creative, which I don't think happens that often in community radio.
Yeah, and I think we were talking, weren't we, before about the sort of the slide is of the event where you're doing some sharing around the podcast, and that was the other thing we were talking about, how it's quite a hard thing to evaluate podcasts and a listening experience. You have to think about it quite quickly.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, so this picture is an event that we ran as part of the podcast. So in my experience, if I was doing this as a traditional publication, if I was doing a book, you would have an event that would launch the whole project. It would be there at the start of the project, and you'd send it into the world. But it is difficult when you're doing a podcast which is very much place-based, but across different places, because we couldn't really pick one park, and we had a few ideas about doing some kind of giving people Walkmans with little headphones, and we'd tell everyone to press play at the same time, but it all was a bit high concept and a bit unmanageable. So this here is when we invited all the writers to the building, and we kind of closed off the project by inviting them to read and invite them to kind of talk a bit about their experiences. And I think they found that valuable, because I think it is the thing that you do when you put together a publication and you bring people together. People do feel invested in, and it gives them a sense of that they're working on something that is clear and solid and you're together. This didn't naturally have that, so we had to kind of confect it at the end.
Richard, we're really kind of coming to the end of our time, so I think there's a few more kind of conclusion and outcomes things that you wanted to touch upon.
Yes, if we just go to the
then we'll bring Rosanna in.
Can you go to the final slide? The things that the project has left us with are, I think the strongest one is just the confidence to do new projects that are more outward facing, engage with the community rather than trying to bring people in. We still do try and bring people in, but we do now feel like we know what to do if we want to do something similar that goes out into the community, talks to people. We've also got, we developed some really strong partnerships, and the image you can see in the back here is not one of the parks that we worked with on this project, but a local sound artist who heard some of the podcast got in touch and said that they were interested in this hidden lake, which is kind of behind a rubbish dump in the neighborhood, and they wanted to create something similar, and were asking how they go about it. So we kind of worked with them to create something called the Secret Lake Stories, which is kind of a bit of a spin-off, if you like, of this project. That I think is really strong and really successful, and we're now working with them on another podcast that is speaking with local migrants in the area, which I think is something we created to speak to some of the feedback we received around representation. The writers all have done very well in terms of the professional development that they've kind of built on and gone on to have success in their practice and their careers. And I think the other thing to kind of think about in terms of the theme that we're talking about is that we do now have a framework for how we look at engagement and how we can improve it and refine it and think about it and kind of assign it to projects, work out what they might need individually.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks very much. I'm just going to bring Rosanna in to sort of think a little bit more about that creator side. So, Rosanna, we're quite tight for time. So just if you want to just give some commentary around you from the thinking about the creators, as Rich has just been talking about. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to how that worked for you, from your point of view?
I guess it might just be helpful to say something very briefly about the mechanisms we use to kind of capture the feedback, like Richard said. We looked at sort of audiences, creators, and wider world. And for the audiences survey, like Richard said, we designed a survey. We actually used, I saw that there was a question in the chat about a bank of questions. We actually used the Culture Counts platform to sort of share statements and ask people like how much they agreed or disagreed with a particular statement. And I think one of the things that made this evaluation task so much fun to kind of work on with Richard was just like the clarity, I think, that the 11th Old Library team had around who they were making this for and what they wanted to learn. I think we often kind of talk about like online work allowing us to reach a global audience, which is great, but like this is a really brilliant example of work that is created for and with a really hyper-local audience. And so when it came to kind of defining what the intended outcomes were, Richard, I think from the start, you were really clear that you wanted to kind of generate a sense of pride in and ownership of the local area and to create that sense of enjoyment. So we kind of mapped the questions and designed the survey on culture counts, which Richard then sort of shared, as he said. And then for creators, yes, we worked, I interviewed again some members of the creative team. We also ran a survey for the writers to ask for feedback. And I guess the only other thing I would say here is that the approach, which I think is the case with both the Replica team and with Levenshulme Road Library, just approaching the evaluation with a genuine sense of curiosity and wanting to learn and wanting to get that feedback and wanting to use it usefully really kind of shines through for me, because I think, sometimes we can be a bit worried about failing or not kind of, achieving what goals we might have set in the first place. And I think evaluation is always more, it's a cliche, but we all often do learn more from the stuff that doesn't go as planned or from feedback that's maybe unexpected. So I think making space for those open questions as well can be really, really fruitful. And I think this project really shows that too.
One of the things that we were asked in advance was about evaluation. Any thoughts you might have on how you might, or thinking about evaluating digital work with diverse audiences? And I picked that up first because I think there was such interesting, Richard talked about the reference to people coming back to him thinking about diversity in the work, but also I'm thinking about diverse audiences in the sense of the people who you have access to, very different for Kerryn and Richard. So in principle, John, think any big sort of overarching thoughts about how you would evaluate digital work with diverse audiences, and then I'll see if anybody else has any thoughts.
I think it's first of all thinking through in your overall approach, is there any biases you may inadvertently have put into your process that are making assumptions about an audience that may be more or less applicable to different groups? We've got, again, in the resources on the website, there's an interesting article around thinking through that and sort of stepping back a bit from that. There are also just really practical barrier issues to think about in terms of audience diversity. So if you've got people who've got some sort of disability, how do you make the process of evaluation accessible, whether that's through form design, through physical access to venues if you're doing in-person things and running focus groups and so on. So there's that aspect too. And there can also potentially be language barriers. So a very practical thing we've touched on, and I mentioned in the chat, the Culture Counts platform, which has many benefits, but the phraseology of some of those dimensions questions, some of the terminology is quite complex. And we've had projects where a significant proportion of the audience may have English as a second language, which means you're then in a bit of a trade-off of, do you deviate from the benefits of having a standard and consistent set of questions and that sort of sector-wide benchmarking in order to tailor something? So that is inevitably something of a trade-off, but is there a way of getting a sense from those audiences where language might be a bit of a barrier, or is it worth bringing in translators and using that sort of process? So there's those things to think about. And even I came across an interesting project that Leicester University is working on, looking at evaluation where you've got neurodivergent audiences, people on the autistic spectrum, and how you might use sort of visual language cues and other ways of getting emotional communication and engagement. So yeah, there's a number of dimensions in which it's really helpful to sort of think through the diversity question.
Richard, was that a thought for you? Obviously, you were saying, you didn't know who was going to come to the park.
Yes, very much so. And I think there's often a struggle along to figure out, if you like, how to think about diversity with audiences, because obviously you can only really get the responses and the opinions and the feedback of the people who you have engaged, and get the responses about what they think works and what they think doesn't work. But it's very hard to then ask a group you have not engaged, who have not engaged with the project, why they haven't engaged and what the reason. So I think being alert to the people who don't take part is important. But I think it necessarily a failure or something's gone wrong. There might be legitimate reasons on both sides why particular groups didn't feel like a certain project or program is something to engage with. But I think it's useful to think about in terms of potentially wider structural or organizational or even social factors rather than a particular project. But those are where the work in sort of fixing those problems, if we do think of them as problems, would probably lie.
Thank you. Kerryn, is there anything that you want to do? Do you have any thoughts around that?
I guess, like Richard said, we were sort of reliant on, I suppose, the venues that we were sharing the work at in terms of their audience reach and then our kind of mailing list. So I guess there might be wider strategies that those venues are using to kind of engage different audiences, but we didn't particularly engage with that in terms of this project specifically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Rosanna, I've got a different question to you, which I think it's about meaning. So the question, again, one that we were sent before the webinar, I'm interested in meaningful stats rather than ones that just look good. What does meaningful digital engagement look like?
Oh, I love this question. I guess I would say that meaningful digital engagement is what you decide is meaningful. So I guess, we are overwhelmed by the amount of things that you can track on any given online platform. And I think that can mean that it can be quite difficult to really be focused on what you are measuring, what it means and what it means for you and your work. So I would say try and identify a goal for what you're doing, and think about what's most relevant to you, and then find the thing that you can measure that best speaks to that. So for example, if you are creating digital content to add value to existing audience members, for example, by providing deeper insights into a program, or engaging people in a conversation about their experience at your venue or with your work, on social media, for example, then the metrics or the things you might track might look like the quality of comments that you're getting and the kind of conversations that might spawn from that, and other sort of, I guess, what I consider depth of engagement metrics, like average watch time on a video. So how long are people spending with the work, which might signal a deeper sense of engagement than a kind of more passive scroll. So I think you can decide what's meaningful, and also sometimes give yourself permission not to do everything, because it can be overwhelming and also isn't always helpful to spread yourself too thinly.
Thank you. And sort of thinking about, you're saying you can decide what's meaningful. I sort of want to go back to the beginning where we talked about, so the case studies have looked at, evaluating the audience experience and the creative experience, but we also talked about the idea that there's value in considering what impact you're you're evaluating what impact you're having on the wider world. And as you've already said, this is a work in progress. It's an area where we're developing interest. And so, John, to start with you, why do you think that this focus on the wider world is really important?
I think in part because it's often, for very good structural reasons, it's the bit that doesn't get much attention. And the structural reasons are it's quite hard by definition to measure impact for people who are not actively involved in the project in some way or other. So there's that factor. And then there's a time factor, which is a lot of this work is kind of project by project. It's often grant funded. There's an evaluation report at the end of the grant. And then there's an inclination naturally to say, right, we've done that. We've secured the final payment. Now let's move on to the next project. So there's no continuity. And some of those wider world impacts are quite long term. I mean, what's interesting in both the case studies, Kerryn and Richard have talked to some of those wider world impacts in terms of, so in Kerryn's case, beginning to think about the distribution network and the opportunities to widen the distribution for this kind of work beyond just this project and beyond just what Kerryn herself is creating. And there's a whole ecology there. So there's the potential from that small piece of research to sort of jump off and look at wider sort of initiatives around digital touring. And so there's a wider world impact immediately there. Richard's already mentioned very specifically artists who've come forward who've said, we'd like to collaborate with you in those partnerships. So I think there are quite light touch ways where you can capture those insights and record them and look over the long term at how the cumulative effect of the projects you're working on are having those wider impacts. And again, this is where having something like, we haven't talked about it today, but a theory of change, an overarching sense of what your cultural organization is trying to do, and then individual project evaluations can look at different aspects of those changes. And if you're tracking some of those across multiple projects, you can begin to build up that picture of where a new partnership's forming, how's that turning into additional work, new projects, etc. So it is trackable. It's just about stepping back and thinking about it, and then we can begin to paint a story of much wider value and impact than is immediately graspable immediately a project finishes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Kerryn, sort of in that sort of, you're talking about evaluating an immersive piece of work. Do you have any thoughts on sort of how you do that or to the benefit of the wider world?
Yeah, I mean, I think John has sort of started to highlight that really. The immersive arts kind of sector and the kind of work we're making with mixed reality and dance is quite new. The technology is new, but also, there isn't an established distribution and touring network for this kind of work yet. And so in terms of kind of thinking from the artist perspective, I feel like sharing the learnings from this kind of project, but even also to the extent of things like, a list of venues that might be interested in programming this kind of work. There isn't an established kind of touring network. So actually, I'm happy to share those resources wider with other artists, because I think actually that peer-to-peer sharing is how we start to evolve those resources. And also, obviously, there are organisations like Immersive Arts and other Arts Council and etc. who are supporting that. But I think, we do need those sustainable models as artists, and it can be a little bit like kind of you just kind of making the work and then having no sense of where actually it's going to go and where you can get it out. So I think if we can share that between us, we'll be a stronger sector kind of going forward.
Lovely, thank you. And so going back to thinking about digital evaluation as a whole, to Rosanna, what do you think are the unique challenges about evaluating we're calling it digital evaluation or evaluating digital projects?
Gosh, I think there's several. I mentioned before, like the kind of sense of overwhelm from the sheer amount of metrics that are available to you if you're using, if you're publishing content online, for example. It can mean that it's quite difficult to decide what to focus on, what things mean. I think you can very easily kind of go down a bit of a rabbit hole of like just being overwhelmed by what you're seeing and kind of not necessarily being able to kind of decide what is meaningful to you. I think linked to that, there is a bit of a lack of a shared language around how we talk about the impact of digital work. So, one thing that plays into this is the fact that like different platforms have different metrics for different things. So you're almost never comparing like for likes. And I think, you know, if your video piece attracts 1,000 views, that doesn't mean like 1,000 people saw that video. And I think linked to that is like the issue around, you know, metrics not being directly comparable. So we saw that a couple of years ago with the introduction of Google Analytics 4. But also in terms of, I guess, the sort of another way of thinking about the lack of shared language, I think telling the story of the work can be quite a difficult thing, or like the impact of your work can be quite a challenging thing to do, particularly when you are working with people who don't work in the digital world. You know, how do you tell that in a meaningful way in terms of what impact the work has had on audiences, creators, etc. And you know, lots of people, lots of us who are working in kind of digital producer roles, you are wearing many hats and doing many things. And there's a real kind of, I think, workload issue there in terms of, you know, understandably, evaluation isn't always at the top of your priority list. And so it can feel like it's another thing to do, and it can be quite overwhelming. And I think that's part of what we are trying to do with this work, is to help provide a way into for people and kind of help break it down and be a bit transparent as well about like what we are learning, so that hopefully other people can kind of use some of this stuff as well to their benefit. I'm sorry, I know we're short on time. I'll just say one quick other thing, which is just about, I think we can also be quite overly focused on funder requirements when it comes to evaluating digital work. You know, we are all asked to report to our funders, and you know, we do want to report that nice big shiny audience number, but it often means, I think, that you know, that takes up work, and you know, there is a place for that, but it can often mean that it's difficult to dig deeper and to discover other insights that might be really beneficial to you. You know, we don't have all the answers here, and I think, as John says, we're working with some of the funders on this question as well, and there's an article on our website where we interview some digital specialists from Arts Council England and Creative Scotland about this, and they agree, you know, they see this problem as well, and I think they are sort of, you know, they've told us that they want to kind of encourage us to reflect on genuine learnings as well, but I think how we create space for that more nuanced evaluation piece is a shared challenge, I guess, that lots of us recognise.
So, Richard, just if you could, just a thought on the framework and how that has been helpful, if it has been helpful to you to work within that.
Yeah, well, like I said, we've moved on to a new podcast project that's themed around migrant voices, and it's very useful to be able to go into that, taking a framework to think about how we are going to evaluate it, and knowing that it's something you want to think about from the outset in terms of what does success like, how you're going to measure it, and how do you engage people to help you on that journey, and making sure that those building blocks are just there from the start just makes it less stressful, but also just it gives you focus for what you're doing, because then you don't kind of get halfway through and think, oh, I wish we'd done this earlier, I wish we'd asked people this, I wish we'd engaged this person and got this response from this group of people. It's all kind of built into the delivery of what you're doing. So that for me is very useful, and also just organizationally, it kind of gives us a shared language, if you like, to kind of to apply to some of the work we're doing. So we can kind of look at some of the ideas we might have, and we can already, before we even begin having a full discussion, have a sense of what we're actually talking about, rather than just ideas that we might have that don't really have much scaffolding, if you like, holding them up.
Yeah, thank you very much. So really, we have 2 minutes left. Is there anything that anybody would like to say to the audience they haven't had a chance to do yet? Go on, John.
Just a closing thing, I think, would be to make sure you give space in your evaluation for it to evolve and change. And we've tried to avoid using jargon, but just a little piece. We talk often about formative evaluation, which is helping you to shape and evolve the project that you're working on. And so the importance of getting that early feedback, and then summative, which is about looking backwards at the end about what you've learned. But I think if you've got that, particularly if you're working with a third-party evaluator, to have that as a collaborative partnership and open conversation with that genuine curiosity about what you can learn and how that might feed into the project as you're in the process of delivering it.
Okay, so shall we leave it there? Thank you very much. I've got a good final word.